Welcome to Modern Farm Business Podcast. This podcast is designed to help the farm leader bring their business to the next level. We'll cover everything from leadership and finance to strategy and planning. I'm your host, Dean Hefta. We've been talking about communication skills lately, and in agriculture, we have to be able to connect with groups outside our own. We must be able to share our story with our neighbors who don't farm, with the people making grocery decisions, with legislators and community leaders. And there's a lot to be excited about in ag. We've never had better food safety. Technology is helping us to grow more with less. Erosion and runoff is down. Our production practices are safer and better than ever. But if the only people who know this are our peers, the rest of the world will never understand. So to arm us with some tools to help us to better share our story, I've invited Michele Payn to join us. She's one of North America's leading farm and food advocates. She founded Cause Matters Corp., a company designed to connect the people and science of food and farming. She also started the popular Ag Chat and Food Chat on Twitter and is author of 2 books, No More Food Fights and Food Truths from Farm to Table, an Amazon #1 bestseller. Michele, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, Dean.
So today we're talking about, telling ag story. And, put me in a position here where I'm a farmer and I got into farming because I love farming. And now you're saying, or a lot of our agricultural world is saying, I need to tell ag's story. Why should I, as a farmer, just trying to do my thing, worry about or be interested in telling story, my story or ag story to the general public?
The reality is that today in 2017, we have no choice but to have a conversation to connect farm and food. It is a best business practice. And if we choose not to do that, then we lose our right to farm as we best see fit. So that's about as blunt and as businesslike as I can make it. Now, on a more personal side, I would ask your listeners if you're stubborn, if you're modest, and if you would rather deal with your equipment or your animals than any of this public relations fluff, as some folks like to describe it. And I know some of you are probably nodding your head, and I would just suggest to you that maybe it's time for a bit of a wake-up call, because when you look at everything from chemical usage to GMO to animal welfare issues to antibiotics to regulatory issues, there is no question whatsoever that this conversation is impacting the bottom line of agriculture, and it's impacting your right to farm.
So I can feel maybe a little insulated because I'm just doing my thing, keeping my head down. But what are some situations that you have seen right now or that you've already seen play out that are, you could say, a consequence that the farmers have experienced in certain geographies or certain markets because their voice wasn't strong enough?
Well, I think when you look at seed corn and you consider the fact that 90% plus of all seed corn in the United States is touched by Hawaii, and GMO was actually outlawed in Hawaii more than once because of all of the activist concerns that are out there. I mean, that is something that reaches across the nation. And if you've ever watched seed production and the growth of those products, you know how critical that is. So that's something that would directly impact anybody who's out there growing corn and beans. I think another one, you look at the CRISPR technology and some of the opportunities we have with beans. It will be very intriguing to see how that plays out. But certainly case studies of not having the conversation at all, or perhaps not engaging in it proactively instead of defensively, would include rBST on the dairy side. It would include antibiotic usage in the veterinary feed directive. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the VFD, but I think the reality is we didn't get ahead of that issue fast enough. Gestation stalls on the hog side obviously is another example of lack of proactiveness. So there's any number of these that are out there, and, it can be anything from what's happened with EPA to what's happening in your statehouse. It's not all legislatively driven. A great deal of it is consumer driven. And because of that, in all of my work, Dean, I really try to encourage folks like your listeners to understand that their individual voice matters, and it matters regardless of whether they're talking to their next door neighbor, whether they're having a conversation in the church parking lot, or whether they are on Instagram.
Okay, so I'm farming and I say to you, I'm just not that good of a communicator. I'm not that comfortable with a microphone in my face. I'm not that comfortable defending what we're doing. That's just not for me. Give me some tools or help me size this of what can I do if I don't feel real confident in just telling that story.
Well, I think the first thing that I can do is to help you understand that as a farmer, you are the most trusted resource when it comes to food production. And when you look at studies, Illinois Farm Families several years ago actually had a study that showed that people don't trust farming. They still trust farmers. The difference is that one is a person and the other is a practice. And I know that some of you out there listening probably have a hard time separating the two. But in fact, I think it's important to showcase that the farmer is the trusted source. The challenge is that people don't trust the practice because they don't understand it. So that's a long way of saying you do not need to be the most eloquent speaker. You don't need to be a paid industry spokesperson. What you need to do is to communicate about what's happening on your farm today. Because in a time where 98.5% of the population isn't on a farm or ranch, how is it that we expect them to understand what's going on in our barns and our fields and our tractor cabs and our combine cabs if we're not sharing that at all? And I think that's the challenge that we really have before us. And my research shows there's a lot of different ways to do this. Again, it can be having a conversation in the coffee shop. It can be going into your school classroom and having a discussion. And I will warn you, your eyes will be blown wide open, even if you are in a rural area, about how little students understand about some of these issues. And it can also be through utilizing social media. My research here at Cause Matters Corporation shows that organizations such as the Humane Society of the United States has more than 100-fold increase in their following on Twitter since January of 2009. So my question back to you would be, if your voice is not in the conversation, who do you expect to be speaking on your behalf? Who do you expect to be sharing the farm story?
Yeah, that's powerful. It sounds like the people that have their story maybe on the other side are pretty well organized and pretty well funded.
Well, obviously, there's millions of dollars in many of the activist organizations. But the thing that we all have to keep in mind in agriculture is that we still have the trust of people and farmers. And so the challenge that we have is to help people understand. I mean, I just saw a study the other day, actually two studies that were a couple of years apart, but they're both from Michigan State, which happens to be my alma mater, which is not why I'm using them, but I will say go green. But one study a few years ago showed that 75% of people in the state of Michigan, which is an incredibly diverse agriculture state, 75% of people in Michigan had not been on a farm or ranch in the last 5 years. That's terrifying to me. So if we're not taking it to them, how do we expect them to understand? And then I would also share a study that was just released at the beginning of September, showed that I believe it was around 30% of the U.S. population didn't know that there were genes in their food if they were non-GMO. And perhaps you laugh. I mean, you couple that with Jason Lusk's study out of Oklahoma State that showed that 75% of people thought that their food should be labeled if it has DNA in it. And it becomes rather damning. But that's what we're dealing with. And when I wrote Food Truths from Farm to Table, one of the greatest challenges I had that I would challenge every listener to think about is how can you translate the science of agriculture, the incredible technicalities of what you do every day? How can you translate that in a way that is meaningful to a population and makes sense if they think that their food needs to be labeled if it has DNA in it?
Are there other industries that you've seen that have been really effective at getting their story out? I mean, what can agriculture learn from other places?
I think one of the best places that we can learn from, quite frankly, are the activists. I would never suggest that we perhaps lack the integrity that we've seen amongst some of that crowd, but what I really try to encourage folks to understand, and you can see this in billboards driving down the street if you pay attention, is I really try to encourage farmers, agribusinesses, anyone in agriculture is to consider connecting with people's hot buttons. Those are the things that really excite them. They can be positive. They can be negative. They can be related to agriculture. They cannot be related to agriculture. So, for example, when you look in the grocery store, many of the labels that are out there are meant to promote guilt within the mom crowd in particular. And when you consider some of the hot buttons that moms usually have, which are the safety of their children, the well-being of their family, keeping things simple, when they're told over and over by groups such as the Environmental Working Group that farmers are pouring chemicals on their food and that they definitely need to buy everything organic that's on their dirty dozen list, it creates some challenges for us. And so I think one of the best ways, if we can be open-minded enough, is to step back and take a look at what's being done on the other side and consider how we can connect on a more emotional level. And I know a lot of folks aren't going to like hearing this, but you have to connect with people's feelings and emotions.
Well, that's exactly what we've seen forever of what works. It's always the emotion. And I think that can be frustrating for anybody that's in an industry because they see how people spin out of control on emotional things. And we think that's crazy. But I love your point of what can we learn from them, because they're using emotion that's maybe not grounded in much fact. How can we have fact behind the emotion and connect the stories? People in town really want to know about their food, don't they?
Oh, they absolutely do. And the reality is we will never have the right to talk about facts or science. We will never earn the right to have the conversation if we can't connect with them on an emotional level first. Maya Angelou has a great quote that I use in a lot of my keynotes that says, people will forget what you do. They'll forget exactly how you farm. People will forget what you say. For example, the perfect soundbite that you've been trained to give. But people will never, ever forget the way that you make them feel. And my point in all of this is that if we can make people feel good about agriculture and at least create a question mark so that when they see a claim in the grocery store on a food label, or when they see a video from an activist, or they see a piece of legislation, if people at least have a question mark and can say, you know what, I talked to Joe Doe down the road. He farms. He's a good guy. He made me feel good. I don't think that fact, that label, that regulation is true. We win because the question mark has been created. But again, we do not earn the right to share our vast technical knowledge, our data. You don't get to show any of your GPS maps. You don't get to use any of the science that we have to back us up until you earn the right through heart work. And I know that makes a lot of folks that are out there listening very uncomfortable, but it's the reality of the society in which we live.
You started off by talking about having a conversation with people. Could you give us some construct or some view of what makes for a healthy conversation versus what sometimes can be so emotional it turns into more of a conflict?
Sure. So one of the first things that we have to do when we have a conversation is to take down our defenses. And I have dairy cattle, so I understand how people feel when you hear people attacking your practices, because trust me, horrible things have been said about what dairy farmers do to cattle. What you really need to do is make sure that you have your defenses down and you start asking questions. Well, why do you feel that way? Where did you get that information? And what does that make you think about? And then to listen to their answers, not just to respond defensively. That's one of the great challenges that we have in agriculture is when we're all up in arms, everybody will react and get on board. But when it's day to day, we want to worry about getting out there and getting the harvest in or planting in spring or calving season. Whatever line of farming you're in, the reality is we don't want to focus on this every day. But we have to proactively. And the best way to do that is to ask really good questions, listen, and then come back in a way which translates the science of our business to the person you're talking to. This is not about educating. It is absolutely about having a conversation.
Makes sense. And I mean, I've seen this play out, whether it's in the safety of my food or what the farmer is doing next to my place here, and I live in a small town. I found the size of community that I live in, it doesn't matter. I could live in a 200-person town, and the people still are are not, in many cases, understanding what's going on in farming and in agriculture.
I would absolutely agree, and the statistics point to that. But the reality that we need to accept is we're 4 to 5 generations removed at this point. I mean, the statistics clearly show we are in the distinct minority, 1.5% of the population. And so sometimes just having a conversation, for example, my daughter the other day is in her first year of agriculture education. She decided she wanted to do a food science demonstration for their CBE project, and she decided she wanted to do it on biotechnology and gene editing. And based upon her classmates that I know, some of them had never heard of such a thing. And just taking the time to use some descriptions of what it is that we do, and more importantly, why we do what we do. I mean, why are you out there using chemicals? Why do you need pesticides? Why does GMO help the environment? And translating the science through story, whether it's your everyday practices or whether it's something that you know to be true across the industry, those stories are absolutely critical.
So you mentioned school, the local school. As a farmer, I can go talk to the school. Do I just call up the principal and say, hey, I'm a farmer. I want to talk to your kids? Do I talk to one of my commodity organizations if I want to do more of that? How do I kind of make the leap in getting my local message out?
Well, there's a lot of different ways, and school is only one of them. The radio show is another one. Going and talking on the Hill is another one. So typically the best way to get into schools is to go to somebody that you have a trusted relationship with. So if you have children in school, you have a trusted relationship because you know the principal, you know the teachers. And then if you don't have that, there's lots of organizations from commodity groups to farm bureaus that could help you identify schools that are of interest. And there's ambassador programs such as the Mid-America Crop Ambassador Program that go into schools at harvest time and actually have a ready-made presentation. So I would suggest that you first identify specifically who you want to talk to, what type of group, to be clear. So whether that would be teachers or legislators or your local media or a group of moms or a preschool group, or perhaps you want to target somebody on Twitter. Or target a specific target audience on Twitter, rather, then you need to know what their interests are, what their hot buttons are, so that you can relate to them.
Great. So let's distill it down here. Give me one thing that I should really make sure that I do share, and then give me something that I shouldn't do when I'm telling the story. Give me one of each.
So something you should absolutely do is to take 15 minutes a day to share your story. 15 minutes. And I know that sounds like a lot, but I will tell you that studies have also shown that people tweet from the toilet pretty extensively. I'll just let that one rest so you can figure out how to do that. And I also know that you're probably on auto steer. So there's a lot of different ways to do that online. But I would say investing the time proactively in 15 minutes a day to have the conversation to connect farm and food is huge. Something not to do is be defensive. We have a tendency to come off as arrogant and defensive when we stand up and say, oh, silly consumers, let me educate you on how your food is grown. I will tell you, as a mom, I have a right to choose the food and nutrition for my family based on my own standards. And as a mom, if somebody wants to stand up and act like they need to educate me, I'm likely not to be real receptive. Now, if somebody says they want to have a conversation and share firsthand perspective, I'm glad to have that conversation. So I would just encourage everyone out there listening to bite your tongue once in a while. Don't be defensive about agriculture and open your ears a little bit. You might be surprised at what you hear.
That is excellent. Joining us today has been Michele Payn. She's founder of Cause Matters Corp, as well as Ag Chat and Food Chat on Twitter, and author of 2 great books, No More Food Fights and Food Truths from Farm to Table. Michele, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insights.
Well, thank you. And I'd invite any of you to connect with me at causematters.com.
Great. Thanks. It's hard to overstate the importance of this topic. What we know is if we don't have a unified voice, if we don't tell our story, others will tell a story on our behalf, and it won't be the one that we would tell. There are people on the other side of this issue of modern agriculture that have their own agenda and they are organized. And we have the ability, through our authenticity and the trust that the consumer has in the farmer, to tell our story. The key is we each have to make that decision to do so. I've seen it firsthand about how when you go into the school, I've done this and shared the story of agriculture, how the kids' eyes light up and how you're able to give them perspective that nobody else has given them. And when they have that experience, it changes their outlook for the rest of their life. So the question is, what can you do in just your community, in your church, at Rotary in town, on social media, wherever it is that you can have dialogue, have discussion? Think about telling your story. It doesn't have to be a perfect story. People would rather hear a true and authentic and imperfect story than a highly polished one that they just don't trust. They want authenticity. They want your story. Next, think about your gifts that you can use in your way. Maybe you have a unique location of your farm. Maybe you are already connected on social media and can use that in a different way. Maybe it's simply choosing to step out on a daily basis or on a small basis in your community. It's making the choice. And finally, in those conversations, as Michele encouraged us, don't get defensive. In fact, go back a couple episodes, listen to Joseph Grinney's advice on crucial conversations and how we can make sure to have that conversation and that discussion rather than combat. Because when we're keeping our composure, when we're professional, we win. Thank you for joining me on another episode here of Modern Farm Business Podcast. I hope there's some tools that you can take away for your communication toolbox. If you have any thoughts, ideas, questions, be sure to send me an email, dean@modernfarmbusiness.com. Be sure to subscribe where you get your podcasts to this, and tell your friends about Modern Farm Business Podcast. Thanks for joining me, and I'll look forward to visiting with you again next week.